Today's video is sponsored by Delete Me. In my last video, I looked at how miniaturization had dramatically and exponentially improved computing power over the last 60 years and how it had affected all our lives. And this reminded me of a video I did back in 2016, comparing a typical $1,000 home computer and iPad Pro to the top 10 supercomputers of the time. That was 8 years ago, and supercomputers were still being talked about as the ultimate in computing power. But since then, things have changed and we don't hear that much about them today. So what has happened in the space of just 8 years that would overshadow the most powerful computers available? And what is their future? Well, first of all, we need to know what a supercomputer is. Back in the day when most computers were things that only large companies could afford, they were general purpose machines, doing all the things like accounts for large companies, the sort of work that would be done by lots of humans with typewriters and calculators before. And then there were high-performance machines that were doing highly specialist jobs, such as simulating nuclear explosions, forecasting the weather, modelling quantum mechanics, or the creation of new molecules, all the sort of things that required huge amounts of calculations to be done. Because the number of calculations required was so vast, the speed of these machines had to be much faster to be able to deliver results in a reasonable amount of time, and this was the realm of the supercomputer. The first supercomputers were introduced in the 1960s and made by Seymour Cray at the Controlled Data Corporation, or CDC, and eventually Cray Research after he left to form his own company. These were effectively highly tuned versions of conventional designs, using high-performance components, such as silicon transistors rather than germanium ones, and running at higher clock speeds, usually by cooling them down to keep the speed up and the reliability too. During the 1960s, parallelism was gradually added, going from one processor to 4 processors, for example. Then in the 1970s, vector processors, which operated on very large arrays of data, became the dominant form. Vector processors work on large sets of one-dimensional arrays using lots of simple processors, all under the control of a master control unit. Instead of having a single powerful CPU working on one instruction at a time, a vector processor could load up large arrays of data in one clock cycle and have many simple arithmetic logic units work on each piece of data separately, but in parallel under control of the master CPU, greatly increasing the throughput. This is something which we still have today, with powerful general-purpose CPUs in our computers working on one piece of information at a time, with maybe up to 32 separate processor cores, and in graphics processing units working very much like vector processors to create large image data for our displays, with several thousand simple processing cores all working on separate bits of data, but all at the same time. Something that supercomputers don't tend to do, though, is data mining, the sorting of information about people to build up profiles which can then be used by advertisers and others to try and home in on exactly what they think we want to see, hear and buy. And those profiles are worth money. The basis of that information comes not only from our online activities but offline details like names, current and past addresses, phone numbers, age, occupation, passport details, and much more. That personal information is traded by data brokers, companies that buy and sell data to anyone that wants it. If you work in the government, the military, the civil services, or have a high profile, this can be a security or even a personal safety risk. You can request for data brokers delete the information they hold on you, but with over 750 of them around the world, where do you start? And this is where today's sponsor, Delete Me, comes in. Delete Me have been helping people in the US, UK and Europe since 2010 to get their personal information removed from data brokers. Delete Me is simple to use. You just select the plan you want, fill in the online application. Delete Me will contact hundreds of data brokers to remove you from their lists. You receive regular privacy reports that show how much data was found, where it was found, and where it was removed. You can do this for yourself or for your family, and if you use the joindeleteme.com/droid link in the description below or scan the QR code next to me today, you'll get a 20% discount. One of the most famous supercomputers was the Cray 1, which was released in 1975. This used the vector processor design to greatly increase its speed over previous designs. It was the first Cray computer to use integrated circuits. Even though they'd been available since the 1960s, they weren't fast enough up until the mid-70s to be used in a machine of this caliber. The Cray ran at 80 MHz clock speed at the same time as the first microprocessors were running at just 1 MHz and could perform 160 megaflops, which was several times faster than any other machine on the market. Even the shape was designed to maximize speed, which also garnered a lot of attention as it was almost like a piece of furniture rather than a computer. Instead of a straight cabinet, it was bent into a C shape with the fastest parts of the computer arranged in the central section, where the connecting cables could be precisely cut to the shortest lengths, which would speed up the transmission of the data inside, and the slower modules would be arranged on the outside of the machine where the signals took slightly longer to get to. The bench seat around the bottom covered the refrigeration unit, which kept it cool. Like all supercomputers of the time, they used individual ICs to make up custom logic circuits, which were tuned for performance, and their operating systems were also created for that particular system. Just around this time, the first microprocessors like the Intel 8080, the MOS Technology 6502, Motorola 68000 and Zilog Z80 were powering the first generation of home computers. As in the 80s and 90s that followed, Intel gained a dominant position in the CPU market with their x86 series, like the 286, 386, 486, and then the Pentium processors in the now personal computers. Meanwhile, supercomputers continued to be specialist-built machines, with Cray leading the market for almost the next 2 decades. However, there were limitations to having a super-fast computer due to the technology of the time. So starting in the 80s, massively parallel architectures were created with hundreds or thousands of CPU cores using microprocessors and or maths coprocessors, which used to be an additional chip you could plug into your PC to greatly increase its maths performance. In Japan in 1992, Fujitsu made some of its processors using gallium arsenide to gain higher speeds, although this was normally reserved for microwave applications only due to its toxicity, and in 1994 it reached peak speed of 1.7 gigaflops with 166 vector processors using this technology for numerical wind tunnel testing. But one of the problems with running massively parallel supercomputers was the software and operating system had to be specifically written for each individual computer. By the mid-1990s, general-purpose CPUs like the Intel x86 and the Sun Spark processors had increased in performance by so much that supercomputers could use these as processing units instead of custom-built chips, reducing the cost, and by 1999 the first Linux-powered supercomputer, the Roadrunner, was built with off-the-shelf parts based on clusters of 8 dual 333 MHz Pentium II processors and was considered one of the top 100 computers at the time. Now all supercomputers use bespoke tuned versions of Linux as their operating systems. As time has gone by, supercomputers have gone down one of 2 paths. Either they are grid-based and made up of many distributed computers over a wide area, or they are a computer cluster, where the hardware is all close together in one place and works as a single system. Something else which has been added to the power is the use of general-purpose graphics processing units, or GPGPUs. These are usually based on the same technology that you would find in high-end graphics cards, like the CUDA cores for the NVIDIA cards, but are used for things like 3D rendering and scientific simulations. These use techniques similar to vector processing, with many of the top cards using thousands of processors which perform specific processes that work in parallel to greatly increase the throughput of data. To give you an idea of just how powerful these are, the top-range NVIDIA RTX 4090 graphics card is about 40 times the power of the top-of-the-range Intel i9 1490 CPU with 24 cores. However, these graphics processing cores are usually optimized to do certain jobs, and it can be difficult for them to cope with non-parallel complex jobs effectively when compared to a general-purpose CPU like the Intel i9, which is why we don't use GPUs as the main processors. So modern supercomputers now use a mixture of general-purpose CPUs and GPUs to handle the very specific applications where highly parallel processing makes them far more useful. And here is one of the reasons why we don't see supercomputers as much as we see massive server farms. The cost of running a supercomputer, like the most powerful one in the world to date, the Hewlett-Packard El Capitan, is very expensive, not only to run but also to build. Its build cost was in the region of $600 million, and its power consumption is in the region of 40 to 50 megawatts, which is nearly enough to run a large town of nearly 90,000 houses. The computational power of El Capitan is in the exaflop range, which tops out at a maximum performance of 2.746 exaflops, which is equivalent to 2,746 petaflops. This means that it will be used for the most demanding jobs like simulating nuclear bomb tests, now that real tests have been banned for decades, and something which can't be given over to general-purpose server farms on the grounds of national security. If you're going to make a very large investment in computing, a server farm would give you a better return on investment than a supercomputer. Over the last decade, there has been a rise in the number of huge server farms, which computationally can be almost equally as powerful as a supercomputer, but are part of larger corporate groups like Amazon AWS. These can be rented out in parts on a pay-as-you-go basis to individuals, companies or governments, and make more money out of them than building highly specialized supercomputers doing just one job at a time for one client. Cloud computing, the new grid computing, can be quickly pulled together from many geographically dispersed locations to create the power of on-the-fly supercomputers to do specific jobs when needed, and then when it's finished, turn back over to many smaller jobs for lots of clients in a very short space of time. The most powerful supercomputers draw as much power and require large amounts of cooling as a large server farm, and both of these now struggle to find locations that can supply low-cost electrical power and the cooling requirements. This is why places like Iceland and Norway are seen as almost ideal places because of their low-cost geothermal or hydroelectric power generation, and cold climate means that costs can be kept to as low as possible. The rise in artificial intelligence has also created a huge demand for processing power, which is using mostly GPUs rather than that of specialist computers. Some industry leaders have now been saying that we might be seeing the last of the truly powerful single-purpose supercomputers soon, and their replacements will be conglomerations of server farms spread across the world which can be rented out by the hour to anyone who can afford it. One thing that would keep supercomputers super and in a league of their own would be the development of real-world reliable quantum computers. When these become available, they will be used for solving the most difficult tasks, like cracking a 2048-key RSA encryption in hours rather than billions of years with a normal supercomputer, at least until someone creates a quantum-proof encryption method. Although they wouldn't be used for the more menial tasks that server farms would do, there's no point in having a quantum computer answer questions on a super ChatGPT, for example, but it would be used to be able to design new AI systems, as well as answer some of the most difficult questions in science today far faster than any of our current technology, and they really would be supercomputers in every sense of the word. So thanks for watching, and a big thanks go to all of our patrons for their ongoing support.